Hello and welcome to the channel. So today I'm going to be comparing a 50cc to a 60cc gas chainsaw. If you're in the market for a gas saw and you've been trying to decide whether a 50 or a 60cc saw is a better choice for you, this video may be useful. I'm going to be comparing cut speeds between the two saws and also be talking about some scenarios in which one may be preferable to use over the other. So on my bench today I have a couple of Stihl professional chainsaws. These are my own personal saws. This is not a sponsored video. Over here I have the Stihl MS261. It's a 50cc gas saw and I've been using it pretty consistently over the last 4 years. It's a strong performer, has excellent power to weight ratio, and for me it's been perfectly reliable so far. Now over here is my Stihl MS362. So technically it's a 59cc saw, but it competes in the 60cc class of saws. It's also a strong performer. In fact, it has almost identical power to weight ratio as the 261 here, but I haven't had it quite as long, so I can't really speak to reliability yet. And I'm really interested today to find out how these two compare in a side-by-side cut comparison. You can probably tell that these two saws have a lot of similarities. They're both using these sort of swept-back cylinder heads that Stihl uses on their newer chainsaws these days. They're also using very similar top cover designs. The sight lines on the side are basically the same, and the controls are basically the same as well. And in fact, these two saws are using a lot of interchangeable parts. For example, the air filters are identical, the fuel and oil caps are the same, the spark plugs are the same, and other miscellaneous parts are the same as well. In fact, in the process of making this video, I found out that the side covers are identical because I accidentally swapped them and they both fit. The primary differences between the two saws are evident in the specifications. The MS362 is basically the bigger brother to the 261. It's a bit stronger, a bit heavier. Of course, it's more expensive as well. But the 362 can handle a larger bar. The max recommended bar length for this saw is 25 inches. Whereas the maximum recommended bar length for the 261 is only 20 inches. And there's one more difference which relates to the chain configurations. The MS261, it comes with a 0.325 inch chain, and the 362 comes with a 3/8 chain. So in order to eliminate any impact that the chain configurations may have on the cutting speed tests, I've decided to put on this 0.325 inch sprocket onto my 362, and that'll allow me to use the same bars and chains between both saws. Now there's one more difference that I wanted to point out between these two particular saws. Both models were available with either the standard adjustable carburetor or Stihl's M-tronic electronically controlled carburetor. Now the MS261 just happens to have the standard carburetor, which is adjustable, as you can see from the adjustment screws here, whereas the MS362 just happens to have the M-tronic carburetor. Now I haven't used the M-tronic carburetor extensively enough to have really formed an opinion, so I'm going to hold my thoughts until I've had a chance to test these out side by side. Then I'll let you know what I think about each one. So I plan to primarily be using the MS362 for slabbing lumber. So I'm going to start the comparison with some rip cuts. Now I have outside a Douglas fir log. It's about 6.5 feet long, about 15 inches or so in diameter, that I cut from a recently fallen tree. And I'm going to be making a 6-inch by 6-inch beam with that log. I'll be alternating the saws so that each saw gets approximately the same width of cut, and each saw will get one top cut and one bottom cut. I'm going to be using the same bar and chain for every cut, so after each pass I'll bring the saw in and sharpen up the chain. Now for the bar and chain, I have this Oregon. This is an 18-inch solid bar. It's a professional bar. And then for the chain, I have this Archer rip cutting chain. Now this chain has been profiled to a fairly shallow angle so that it creates a smoother cut. Of course, that also makes it create a lot of fine dust, but it's a slow cutting chain, which I think will help to highlight the differences in cutting speed a little bit better. Just to be clear, I'm using a modified chain here. I believe the Archer ripping chains are sharpened to about a 10-degree angle from the factory, but I reprofiled the cutters to a more acute angle for a smoother cut. So the cutting speeds here are going to be slower than what you would normally see on an unmodified chain. Okay, so let's take a look at the rip cutting results. So after averaging up both cuts for each saw and excluding any downtime for inserting wedges and such, the MS261 cut on average at about 2 minutes, 14.5 seconds, whereas the average cut time for the MS362 was only 1 minute and 57 seconds. So the 60cc saw saved me about 17.5 seconds on average per cut versus the 50cc saw, and that's about a 13% better cut speed. Okay, so up next I'll do a crosscut comparison. So I have some Douglas fir rounds out there which are about 17 to 20 inches in diameter or so, and I'll go ahead again and make some cuts with each chainsaw, and I'll average out the cut times, and I'll go ahead and alternate between each saw so that each one gets roughly the same width of cut each time. Now in this case I'll be using a couple of these Oregon L74 control cut chains. I happen to have 2 of these which are in roughly the same condition, and I've gone ahead and sharpened both chains. And after I make a few cuts, I'll bring the saws back in, I'll freshen up the chains, then I'll swap the bars and chains for the subsequent cuts. Okay, so let's take a look at the crosscut results. So in this case, the 60cc saw cut about 12% faster on average than the 50cc saw, and that's roughly in line to the 13% better cut speeds that we saw in the rip cutting test. Now the MS362 has some pretty impressive specs. It only weighs about 13.9% more than the 261, but it outputs about 15% more horsepower. So our 12 to 13% better cut speeds for the 362 seem to be a little bit on the low side. On the other hand, this is not really a scientific test, and there are probably a lot of possible reasons for that. Now the biggest one in my mind is the fact that this is still a newer saw. It's only had a couple of tanks of fuel run through it, and typical break-in procedures from what I've read usually start at around 5 tanks of fuel or more. So as I use the 362 more, it'll continue to break in, and I should see faster cut speeds. Okay, so I've done a lot more cutting with these two chainsaws side by side over the last 3 weeks, so I've formed some opinions. And the first thing that I'll say is that these are both really nice chainsaws. You know, they are professional grade saws. They're really well balanced. They feel nice in the hand, and they don't vibrate excessively. And the feature sets between the saws are close enough to where there wasn't much of an adjustment for me switching from one saw to the other. Now, The 60cc saw clearly cuts faster than the 50cc saw, but it also weighs about 1.5 pounds more. Now that weight difference wasn't really noticeable when I was slabbing lumber, and I think that's because 1.5 pounds relative to the combined weight of the chainsaw plus the Alaska mill is a pretty small percentage. Plus, once you start cutting, that weight's going to be supported by the log anyway. But that difference in weight was a lot more noticeable when I was bucking, and especially noticeable when I was cutting limbs. The MS261 being so light is just a lot more nimble and easier to operate at different angles. And I was noticing with the 362, my forearms would get tired a lot more quickly in doing that kind of work. So yes, while the 362 does cut faster, at least with normal firewood chores, the MS261 is completely fast enough. You know, the speed versus weight trade-off is primarily a personal preference issue, but there's one clear advantage that the MS362 has over the 261, and that's the capability for a longer bar, as I mentioned before. There are loggers in my local area here that operate at 362 with bars longer than the recommended 25-inch bar, and those get a lot of really hard use, and they seem to last for years. So I think if you need to cut larger wood, the larger chainsaw seems to be the obvious choice. Okay, so let's talk about the carburetors. So again, the 261 has a standard carburetor, whereas the 362 has the M-tronic carburetor. And I did a bunch of cold starts over the last 3 weeks with both saws side by side in near freezing temperatures. And both saws always started right up. And once they were warm, they both ran really strongly and smoothly. Now, the 362 did take a little bit longer to warm up usually, but it does have a larger engine. And besides having a half choke position on the MS261, the standard carb, I really didn't see much difference in terms of operation. You know, I guess if I were a logger and I were operating at different elevations at different times, or maybe I had to operate with different fuel mixtures, the electronically controlled carburetor might be an advantage. But for my use, I really prefer the simplicity and the lower repair costs of a standard carburetor. So to sum up, both of these chainsaws offer the same basic features, and both offer excellent power to weight relative to their competition. The MS362 to me just feels like a scaled up version of the MS261, and both are excellent options. Now, besides being cheaper, the MS261 is lighter, more nimble, it's a bit quieter and a bit easier to pull over. And the 362, it's obviously stronger and more durable and more suited for harder use. So I plan to use the MS261 primarily for typical firewood tasks, and the MS362 primarily for slabbing, and on the occasion when I have a larger tree to cut. So I hope this video was useful. Let me know if you'd like to see updates on these saws in the future. And if you have any inputs or comments or questions, put them down in the comments section, and we'll see you next time.